The sound came from my backyard at 6:17 in the morning. At first, I thought I was dreaming. Then I heard it again. Metal scraping against wood. Slow. Deliberate. The kind of sound that instantly tells you someone is touching something that belongs to you. I sat upright in bed before I was fully awake. For a few seconds, I simply listened. Silence. Then another scrape. My stomach tightened. Ever since my husband died 8 months earlier, every unexpected noise felt different. Louder. Sharper. More personal. I grabbed my robe and walked toward the bedroom window overlooking the backyard. The morning sky was still pale grey. Dew covered the grass. And standing beside my fence was my neighbor, Frank. Again. My name is Teresa Nolan. I'm 55 years old. And the morning I found Frank inside my backyard was the moment I realized something was very wrong. 8 months earlier, my life looked completely different. My husband, Daniel, and I had lived in that house for nearly 27 years. We raised our daughter there. Celebrated birthdays there. Argued over paint colors there. Built a life there. Then one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. A heart attack. Sudden. Brutal. Final. One moment Daniel was discussing weekend plans. The next moment he was gone. People talk about grief as if it's one emotion. It isn't. It's 100 emotions that take turns attacking you. Shock. Loneliness. Confusion. Anger. Fear. Sometimes all before breakfast. The first few months after Daniel died passed in a blur of casseroles, sympathy cards, and people telling me to call if I needed anything. Most never called again. Frank did. At first, I appreciated it. He lived next door with his wife years ago, before she passed away. He knew what loss felt like. Or so I thought. The first time he knocked on my door after the funeral, he brought over homemade soup. The second time, he offered to mow the lawn. The third time, he repaired a loose porch step. Everyone told me how lucky I was to have such a thoughtful neighbor. Including me. Back then. But somewhere along the way, something changed. Or maybe I simply started noticing things I hadn't wanted to see. Frank never called before coming over. He never asked if I needed help. He simply appeared. Sometimes in the driveway. Sometimes in the garage. Sometimes already standing in my backyard. Like he belonged there. Like the property line between our homes was merely a suggestion. And each time I tried to politely create distance, he somehow acted offended. "I'm just helping," he'd say. Daniel would have appreciated it. That sentence always stopped me. Because Daniel wasn't there to disagree. Standing at my bedroom window that morning, I watched Frank kneel beside the fence and inspect something near the posts. My fence. My yard. My property. Without asking. Again. Then he looked up. And for a brief second, our eyes met through the glass. He smiled. And waved. As if finding him inside my backyard before sunrise was perfectly normal. That's when a strange feeling settled into my stomach. Not fear. Not yet. Something colder. A question. Why was Frank becoming so interested in my property? And why did it feel like he was slowly treating it as his own? What I discovered over the next few weeks would make that question far more disturbing than I could have imagined. The first time I seriously questioned Frank's behavior happened 3 days after I found him near my fence. Until then, I had been doing what many widows do. Making excuses. Explaining away discomfort. Convincing myself that gratitude and boundaries could somehow occupy the same space. They can't. Not for long. That Thursday afternoon, I was planting spring flowers near the front porch when I heard the familiar sound of tires crunching over gravel. Frank's truck. I looked up. He was already pulling into my driveway. Not stopping near the road. Not calling first. Pulling all the way in. As though arriving at his own house. I set down my gardening gloves and watched him climb out carrying a toolbox. Immediately, something inside me tightened. "Afternoon, Teresa," he called. "Hi, Frank." He smiled. The same smile everyone in the neighborhood seemed to trust. The same smile that made me feel guilty whenever I questioned his intentions. "I noticed your gutters are clogged," he said. I glanced up at the roof. The gutters looked perfectly normal. "Oh. I wasn't aware." "No problem. I'll take care of it." "Not would you like me to?" "Not do you need help?" "Just. I'll take care of it." As if the decision had already been made. I forced a polite smile. "That's kind of you, but I can hire someone." For a brief second, something changed in his expression. It happened so quickly I almost missed it. A flash of irritation. Gone instantly. Replaced by friendliness. No sense wasting money. Money. That word had started appearing often lately. Too often. Frank seemed unusually interested in my finances. Not directly. Never directly. Instead, he asked casual questions. Questions disguised as concern. Had I spoken with an estate planner? Was maintaining a large house difficult alone? Had property taxes increased? Did I ever think about downsizing? At first, I assumed he was making conversation. Now I wasn't so sure. Frank climbed his ladder before I could protest again. For the next 20 minutes, I stood in my own yard feeling strangely uncomfortable while my neighbor worked on my house without permission. Several times I almost told him to stop. But grief changes people. After losing Daniel, I found myself avoiding conflict whenever possible. I was tired. Emotionally exhausted. The idea of arguing over gutters felt ridiculous compared to burying a husband. So I said nothing. That evening my daughter Megan called. She lived in Chicago with her husband and 2 young boys. We talked every few days. Sometimes about important things. Sometimes about absolutely nothing. That night I mentioned Frank casually. "Megan, do you think it's strange if a neighbor keeps helping without being asked?" The silence on the phone lasted longer than expected. "How often?" I thought for a moment. Then I started listing examples. The lawn. The porch. The fence. The garage. The gutters. The flowers he planted near my mailbox without asking. The spare key he insisted I leave with him. The packages he sometimes collected before I got home. As I spoke, the list sounded worse. Longer. More intrusive. "Mom." Something in Megan's voice immediately caught my attention. "Yeah. That's not normal." I looked out the kitchen window toward Frank's house. His lights were on. I could see him moving around inside, watching television, living his life, looking perfectly ordinary. "He means well," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, they sounded weak. Megan hesitated. "Maybe." Then she added, "Or maybe he's getting too comfortable." Too comfortable. The phrase stayed with me long after our call ended. Later that night, I took the trash outside. The air smelled like fresh rain. The street was quiet, peaceful, normal, until I noticed something near the edge of my property. At first I thought it was a survey marker. A small wooden stake partially hidden in the grass. I walked closer, then froze. Because there wasn't just one. There were 3. Placed along the property line between my yard and Frank's. I stood there staring at them. Confused. Uneasy. And suddenly one question kept repeating inside my head. Who put them there? And why hadn't they been there yesterday? The wooden stakes were still there the next morning. That bothered me more than it should have. Not because they were large. Not because they damaged anything. But because they represented something I couldn't explain. Someone had entered my property. Again. And this time they had left evidence behind. I stood near the edge of the yard holding my coffee mug while studying them in the early sunlight. 3 small stakes. Placed deliberately. Evenly spaced. Not random. Not accidental. Purposeful. The longer I looked at them, the more uncomfortable I became. Finally, I pulled out my phone and took several pictures. Then I sent them to Megan. A reply arrived almost immediately. Did Frank put those there? I stared at the message. That was the obvious answer. And somehow the fact that I hadn't immediately assumed it made me realize how much benefit of the doubt I'd been giving him. I typed back. I don't know. A few seconds later. Ask him. Simple advice. Reasonable advice. Yet the thought of confronting Frank made me unexpectedly nervous. That alone should have concerned me. A good neighbor shouldn't make you feel nervous. Around noon, I got my opportunity. I was carrying groceries from my car when I heard his voice. "Morning, Teresa." I looked up. Frank was standing near the property line. Smiling. Watching. The same way he always seemed to be watching lately. I set the grocery bags down. "Frank, can I ask you something?" His smile widened. "Of course." I pointed toward the stakes. "Do you know anything about those?" For the first time, I saw a genuine surprise. Or at least what appeared to be surprise. He glanced toward the yard. Then shrugged. "Survey markers maybe. Did you put them there?" His answer came just slightly too quickly. "No." Something about that bothered me. Not enough to accuse him. But enough to notice. The conversation should have ended there. Instead, Frank walked closer. Thinking about selling? The question caught me completely off guard. What? The house. He nodded toward my property. Big place for one person. There it was again. Selling. Downsizing. Moving. The same subjects he kept returning to. I folded my arms. I'm not planning to move. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Disappointment. Gone before most people would notice it. But I did. Then he smiled again. Just thinking practically. Practically. I heard that word several times over the next few weeks. Always from Frank. Always connected to my house. To my future. To decisions that somehow seemed important to him. After he left, I carried the groceries inside and tried to forget about it. But strange things kept happening. Small things. Individually harmless. Together unsettling. One afternoon I returned home to find my trash cans moved. Another day my side gate stood open. Twice I noticed footprints near the back fence after rain. And each time I found myself asking the same question. Was I imagining it? Or was someone spending time on my property when I wasn't home? Grief makes you doubt yourself. That's one of the cruelest parts. People expect sadness. Nobody warns you about uncertainty. About constantly wondering whether your instincts can still be trusted. A week later, I attended a neighborhood barbecue at the community park. It was the first social event I'd gone to since Daniel died. Part of me wanted to stay home. Another part knew isolation wasn't helping. The park was crowded with families, folding chairs, and children running between picnic tables. For a little while, things felt normal. Then I overheard a conversation that changed everything. I wasn't eavesdropping. I was standing near the refreshment table when I heard Frank's name. Would be a great investment. I turned slightly. Two men from the neighborhood were talking. One of them laughed. Only if he can get the Nolan property too. My stomach tightened immediately. The Nolan property. My property. The other man nodded. That's the whole point. I stopped breathing for a second. What do you mean? The first man asked. The second lowered his voice. Nothing official. Frank's been talking about it for years. Years. The word hit me like ice water. Years? Daniel had only been gone 8 months. Why would Frank be talking about my property for years? Before I could hear more, both men noticed me standing nearby. The conversation stopped instantly. Too instantly. One of them smiled awkwardly. The other suddenly became very interested in his drink. And in that uncomfortable silence, a cold realization settled over me. Whatever was happening. It had started long before my husband died. For the rest of the weekend, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had overheard at the barbecue. Frank's been talking about it for years. The sentence replayed in my head constantly. Years. Not months. Not since Daniel died. Years. Every time I repeated it, the timeline bothered me more. Because if Frank had only become interested in my property after I was widowed, his behavior could be explained by opportunity. But if he'd been talking about my house for years, that meant something else entirely. On Monday morning, I found myself doing something I hadn't done since Daniel passed away. I went into his home office. The room looked almost exactly as he'd left it. His reading glasses still sat beside the desk. A faded baseball cap hung on the corner of a bookshelf. A half-finished crossword puzzle remained inside a magazine near his chair. For months, I had avoided spending time there. Some grief hurts too much to touch. But that morning, I stood in the doorway and felt something different. Not sadness. Curiosity. Daniel had lived in this neighborhood for nearly 3 decades. He knew everyone. including Frank. If something unusual had been happening before his death, maybe he had noticed. I sat down in his office chair and opened one of the desk drawers. Inside were years of paperwork, tax records, insurance documents, home repair receipts. Nothing unusual. At least not at first. An hour later, I was still sorting through folders when I discovered a small notebook tucked behind a stack of binders. I immediately recognized Daniel's handwriting. He used notebooks for everything. Project ideas, shopping lists, random thoughts. The notebook wasn't labeled. I opened it casually, then froze, because one page contained only a single sentence. Need to keep an eye on Frank. My heart skipped. I read it again. Need to keep an eye on Frank. No explanation. No date. Nothing else. Just that sentence. Suddenly the quiet office felt very small. I flipped through the remaining pages. Most contained ordinary notes. Hardware store reminders. Garden plans. Measurements. But several pages mentioned Frank. Brief observations. Nothing dramatic. Nothing conclusive. Yet together they formed a disturbing pattern. Frank asking unusual questions about property values. Frank mentioning developers. Frank expressing interest in nearby lots. Frank complaining about homeowners who refused to sell. I sat back slowly. Daniel had noticed it too. Maybe not everything, but enough to write it down. Enough to remember. Enough to be cautious. A strange mix of emotions washed over me. Validation. Fear. Anger. For weeks I had been questioning myself, wondering whether grief was making me paranoid. Now I wasn't so sure. Later that afternoon, I decided to take a walk. I needed fresh air. Distance. Space to think. The neighborhood looked peaceful. Children rode bicycles. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across lawns. Birds chirped from maple trees. Everything appeared normal, which somehow made the situation feel even stranger. As I passed several houses, I noticed a real estate sign posted on a corner lot. The sign triggered a memory. Years ago, Daniel and I had discussed a small piece of undeveloped land behind our neighborhood. Nothing special. Just several acres owned by different homeowners, including us. I stopped walking, then slowly turned around. A thought had suddenly appeared. One I couldn't ignore. When I got home, I opened my laptop. After nearly an hour searching through county property records online, I found what I was looking for. And my stomach dropped. The undeveloped land behind our neighborhood had recently become valuable. Very valuable. A commercial development company had purchased multiple nearby parcels over the last 2 years. The project wasn't finalized, but it was moving forward. Shopping space. Medical offices. Parking lots. Expansion. Growth. Money. Lots of money. I stared at the screen, then opened another document. Property maps. Ownership records. Parcel boundaries. And that's when I saw it. Several of the remaining parcels needed for the project connected directly to my property. My hands slowly tightened around the mouse. because suddenly Frank's behavior looked very different. The questions, the pressure, the survey markers, the constant talk about selling. It no longer felt random. It felt strategic. Then my phone buzzed. The sudden sound made me jump. A text message. From Frank. I hadn't spoken to him all day. Yet there it was. A simple message. Just one sentence. Hope you're doing okay today. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then looked back at the property maps. And for the first time, I found myself wondering something I never imagined asking about a neighbor. Was Frank checking on me? Or monitoring me? That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, pieces of information kept rearranging themselves in my mind like a puzzle that was finally starting to reveal a picture. The survey stakes. The questions about selling. Daniel's notes. The development project. Frank's constant presence. Individually, none of it proved anything. Together, it was becoming impossible to ignore. Around 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep entirely and walked downstairs. The house was quiet. The kind of deep silence that only exists after midnight. I made tea and stood at the kitchen window staring into the darkness outside. For years, that view had made me feel safe. Now I found myself studying shadows. Looking for movement. Wondering whether someone else had been looking back. The thought made me uncomfortable. I hated feeling suspicious. Especially about someone I had known for decades. Frank wasn't a stranger. He had attended neighborhood cookouts with Daniel. Helped shovel snow after winter storms. Waved from his driveway almost every morning. That was what made this situation so confusing. Bad intentions are easier to spot when they come from strangers. Not from people who have spent years earning your trust. The next morning, I called the county property office. At first, I told myself I was simply gathering information. Nothing more. But deep down, I knew I was looking for confirmation. Or reassurance. Either would have helped. A woman named Cheryl answered several of my questions. Most of the information was public. The development company had indeed purchased multiple parcels nearby. Negotiations were continuing. Several key properties had not yet been acquired. Including mine. I thanked her and was about to end the call when she casually asked, "Are you speaking with one of the local representatives?" I paused. What representatives? There was a brief silence. The people approaching homeowners. A chill ran through me. I don't think so. Oh. Her voice changed slightly. I assumed someone had already contacted you. After hanging up, I sat motionless at the kitchen table. Contacted me? Who? And why hadn't anyone mentioned it directly? An hour later, another strange thing happened. I was watering flowers near the porch when a dark SUV slowly drove past my house. Then again. And again. 3 times within 20 minutes. Maybe coincidence. Maybe not. I tried to dismiss it. Then the vehicle parked down the street. Not directly in front of my house. Close enough. A man remained inside. Waiting. Watching something. Or someone. My pulse quickened. I went back inside and closed the curtains. For the first time since Daniel died, the house didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt exposed. Later that afternoon, Megan called. The moment she heard my voice, she knew something was wrong. What happened? I told her everything. The notebook. The development project. The county office. The SUV. By the time I finished, she was quiet. Too quiet. Finally, she spoke. Mom, I think you need security cameras. I almost laughed. The suggestion sounded dramatic. Extreme. Like something people did after break-ins or threats. Not because of an overly helpful neighbor. Yet the more I thought about it, the more reasonable it seemed. Maybe. I'm serious. I know. Then Megan asked a question I hadn't allowed myself to consider. Do you think Dad knew something? I looked toward Daniel's office. The notebook flashed through my mind. Need to keep an eye on Frank. I don't know, I admitted. But I think he was worried. The words hung heavily between us. Because if Daniel had been concerned, why hadn't he told me more? What had he seen? What had he suspected? And had Frank known Daniel was paying attention? That evening, just before sunset, there was a knock at my front door. 3 sharp knocks. I already knew who it was before I opened it. Frank. Standing there with the same familiar smile. Holding a folder. My stomach tightened immediately. Evening. Teresa. I glanced at the folder. What's that? Oh, just some information. He handed it toward me. Reluctantly, I took it. Inside were printed pages. Maps. Property diagrams. Development plans. My heart started pounding. Frank watched my reaction carefully. Far too carefully. Then he said something that instantly confirmed my fears. You know, eventually everybody around here is going to sell. I looked up. His smile never moved. But some people are smart enough to sell early. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I realized something. This was no longer about helping. No longer about kindness. No longer about being a good neighbor. For the first time, Frank was showing me exactly what he wanted. And I suddenly had a feeling that this conversation was only the beginning. After Frank left, I locked the front door. Then I checked it again. And once more before going to bed. The behavior would have seemed ridiculous a month earlier. Now it felt necessary. I carried the folder he had given me into the kitchen and spread the papers across the table. Maps. Property outlines. Projected development zones. Estimated land values. Everything looked professional. Almost too professional. What bothered me wasn't the information itself. It was the fact that Frank had it. And that he had arrived at my house carrying it like a salesman showing inventory. Not a neighbor. A salesman. Or maybe something worse. For nearly an hour, I studied the documents. The more I read, the clearer one thing became. The development company wanted access to a collection of connected properties. Several owners had already sold. Others were negotiating. A few remained. Including me. My property wasn't just another house. It occupied one of the most strategically important locations in the entire project. That realization sent a chill through me. Because suddenly I understood why Frank kept mentioning practicality. Why he kept asking questions. Why he never seemed willing to leave me alone. I wasn't imagining the pressure. I was the pressure point. The next morning, Megan called before breakfast. I ordered the cameras. I blinked. You what? They arrive tomorrow. Megan. Mom. Her voice softened. You don't have to prove something terrible is happening before protecting yourself. I couldn't argue with that. Partly because she was right. Partly because I had spent the previous night checking my locks like a frightened teenager. By Thursday afternoon, the cameras were installed. One overlooking the driveway. One facing the backyard. One covering the side gate. I felt slightly embarrassed setting them up. Paranoid. Dramatic. Yet the feeling disappeared less than 24 hours later. Because the first alert arrived shortly after midnight. Motion detected. Backyard. I sat upright in bed. Heart racing. For a second I couldn't move. Then I grabbed my phone. The camera footage loaded. At first I saw only darkness. Then movement. A figure. Walking slowly near the back fence. I held my breath. The person wasn't trying to break into the house. Wasn't carrying tools. Wasn't damaging anything. They were simply moving along the property line. Stopping occasionally. Looking around. Studying something. The image quality wasn't perfect. But it was clear enough. I recognized the jacket immediately. Frank. I watched the footage 3 times. Then 4. Then 5. Each viewing made me angrier. Not because I was surprised. Because I finally had proof. For weeks, I'd been questioning myself. Now there it was. A video. A timestamp. Reality. Frank was on my property after midnight. Without permission. Again. The next morning, I called Megan. When she answered, I didn't say hello. I sent the video. 30 seconds later, she called back. What the hell is he doing? I don't know. But deep down, I was starting to form a theory. And I hated it. That afternoon, I decided to do something I had avoided until now. I visited Daniel's closest friend. Roger. The 2 men had known each other since high school. If anyone knew whether Daniel had concerns about Frank, it would be him. Roger welcomed me warmly. His expression immediately softened when I mentioned Daniel's notebook. Then I showed him the entry. Need to keep an eye on Frank. Roger stared at the page for several seconds. Longer than expected. My stomach tightened. You know something. He looked uncomfortable instantly. The kind of uncomfortable people become when deciding whether to tell the truth. Finally he sighed. Daniel mentioned him. My pulse jumped. When? Several times. The room suddenly felt smaller. What did he say? Roger hesitated. Then answered quietly. He thought Frank was trying to buy a property around here. I wasn't surprised. Not anymore. But Roger wasn't finished. He also thought Frank had connections with a local investor group. I stared at him. What kind of investor group? Roger rubbed the back of his neck. The aggressive kind. The phrase sent cold fear through me. Because it sounded less like business. And more like a warning. Then Roger said something that made everything worse. Toward the end, Daniel thought Frank was waiting for someone to become vulnerable. I felt my chest tighten. Vulnerable. A widow. Someone grieving. Someone alone. Someone easier to pressure. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question I had been avoiding for weeks. Do you think he was waiting for me? Roger's silence answered before his words did. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. Frank's behavior after Daniel died wasn't the beginning of his plan. It was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. I drove home from Roger's house feeling physically sick. Not because I had learned something completely new. Because someone had finally confirmed what I had been afraid to admit. Frank wasn't simply overstepping boundaries. He was pursuing something. Patiently. Deliberately. And according to Daniel's suspicions, he'd been doing it for years. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neighborhood as I pulled into my driveway. Everything looked exactly as it always had. The mailbox. The maple tree Daniel planted 20 years ago. The porch swing where we drank coffee on Sunday mornings. Nothing had changed. And yet everything felt different. Because now I was looking at my home through someone else's eyes. An investor's eyes. A developer's eyes. Frank's eyes. Not memories. Not family. Not history. Value. Opportunity. Profit. The realization made me angry in a way I hadn't felt since Daniel's funeral. For months I'd been carrying sadness. Now that sadness was slowly becoming something else. Resolve. As I stepped out of my car, I noticed movement next door. Frank. Standing near his garage. Watching. The moment he saw me, he raised a hand. Smiling. As if nothing had changed. As if he hadn't spent the previous night wandering around my backyard. I forced myself to remain calm. Hi, Frank. Everything okay? The question sounded harmless. But after everything I'd learned, it landed differently. Too interested. Too immediate. I nodded. Fine. For a second, neither of us moved. Then Frank walked closer. Not all the way. Just enough. The distance felt intentional. Calculated. I've been thinking about our conversation. My stomach tightened. Our conversation? The property. Of course. Always the property. Never Daniel. Never grief. Never how I was doing. The property. I folded my arms. I'm not selling. Frank chuckled softly. The sound irritated me instantly. You don't have to decide today. The confidence in his voice bothered me more than the words themselves. As though time was on his side. As though eventually I'd say yes. Then he added. Sometimes people hold on to things because they're emotional. I stared at him. The sentence sounded innocent. But it wasn't. It was an argument. A strategy. A way of turning my attachment to my home into a weakness. This isn't just a property, I said. It's my home. For a brief second, something flashed across his face. Impatience. Then it disappeared. Of course. The way he said it told me he didn't believe it. Or didn't care. That evening, I reviewed the camera footage again. Not just the clip from the previous night. All of it. hour after hour. Most showed nothing unusual. Birds, squirrels, passing cars. Then, shortly after midnight 3 nights earlier, I noticed something strange. A flashlight. Brief. Only a few seconds. Near the fence. I replayed the clip. Again. And again. A figure appeared. Not clearly enough to identify, but clearly enough to recognize one thing. The person wasn't alone. There were 2 people. My pulse quickened. I enlarged the image. The quality deteriorated immediately. Still, I could see movement. Conversation. Gestures. Then both figures disappeared beyond the fence line. I checked another camera angle. Nothing. A third. Nothing. But the timestamp remained. 12:43 a.m. 3 nights ago. The same week the survey stakes appeared. The same week Frank brought development maps to my house. The same week strangers had been driving past my property. That couldn't be coincidence. Could it? The next morning, I called Cheryl from the county office again. This time I asked more direct questions. Can private investors conduct land surveys before purchasing property? She hesitated. Not legally without permission. My grip tightened on the phone. What if they don't own the property yet? Then they need authorization. Authorization. Permission. Neither of which I had given. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. But when it ended, I felt worse. Not better. Because every answer created new questions. Around lunchtime, another unexpected visitor arrived. This time it wasn't Frank. A middle-aged man in a business jacket stood at my door holding a portfolio case. His smile appeared professional. Practiced. Mrs. Nolan? Yes. My name is Victor Barnes. Something about the name meant nothing to me. But the next sentence changed everything. I represent several parties interested in local development opportunities. I felt my stomach drop. There it was. No more hints. No more indirect conversations. Someone had finally come directly. Victor continued smiling. I was hoping we could discuss your property. For several seconds, I simply stared at him. Because suddenly the situation no longer felt like suspicion. Or intuition. Or paranoia. It felt real. Organized. Planned. And as I looked past Victor toward the street, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Across the road, parked half a block away, sat Frank's truck. And he was watching the conversation. For a moment, I forgot Victor was standing on my porch. All I could see was Frank's truck. Parked half a block away. Waiting. Watching. The sight confirmed something I had been resisting for weeks. This wasn't a series of coincidences. It was coordination. Victor cleared his throat. Mrs. Nolan? I pulled my attention back to him. What exactly do you want? His smile remained perfectly professional. I'd simply like to discuss potential opportunities. Opportunities. The word immediately irritated me. People always used pleasant words when they wanted something. Opportunity. Partnership. Flexibility. They never called it pressure. Or manipulation. Victor opened his portfolio and removed several documents. We believe your property could be very valuable. Could be. As though I didn't already know that. As though I hadn't spent days researching the development project. I glanced toward Frank's truck again. Still there. Still watching. Victor noticed. His eyes shifted briefly toward the street. Only for a second. But it was enough. Enough to tell me he knew exactly who was sitting there. My pulse quickened. Do you know Frank? Victor hesitated. A tiny pause. Barely noticeable. Then he smiled. I know a lot of people involved in local projects. Not an answer. A dodge. I folded my arms. I'm not interested in selling. His smile weakened. Only slightly. Many homeowners feel that way initially. Initially. The assumption bothered me immediately. As though my refusal was temporary. As though I simply hadn't accepted reality yet. I mean it. Victor nodded politely. Then handed me a business card. If you change your mind. I took it. Mostly so he would leave. Several seconds later, he walked back toward a black sedan parked farther down the street. The moment he drove away, Frank's truck disappeared too. Almost simultaneously. I stood frozen on the porch, watching both vehicles leave. And that's when the final piece clicked into place. They weren't operating separately. They were connected. That evening, Megan came over. For the first time since Daniel's death, I showed her everything. The notebook. The camera footage. The maps. Victor's card. Every detail. By the time I finished, she looked furious. Not scared. Furious. Mom, this is harassment. I stared at my coffee cup. Part of me wanted to agree. Another part still struggled with the idea. Because admitting it made everything real. Megan reached across the table. You know what's bothering me? What? They all act like your decision doesn't matter. The words landed heavily. Because she was right. Nobody had asked what I wanted. Frank hadn't. Victor hadn't. The investors hadn't. Everyone seemed focused on one thing. Getting the property. Not respecting the owner. For the first time, I felt something stronger than fear. Anger. The next morning, I decided to dig deeper. Much deeper. Victor had left a business card. It included the name of a consulting company. After several hours online, I found public records. Corporate filings. Business registrations. Property transactions. Most were boring. Then I discovered something that made my stomach drop. One name appeared repeatedly. Victor Barnes. Several investor groups. Multiple land acquisitions. And one familiar name. Frank Wilson. I stared at the screen. Then looked again. There it was. Official documentation. Frank wasn't simply a neighbor. He was listed as a local acquisition consultant on several projects. My hands started shaking. Because suddenly everything made sense. The constant questions. The pressure. The maps. The nighttime visits. The conversations. He wasn't helping investors. He was working for them. Or with them. I kept reading. The deeper I searched, the worse it became. Several years earlier, Frank had helped acquire dozens of residential properties for development projects. Many purchases occurred after owners experienced financial hardship, medical problems, divorce, deaths in the family, moments of vulnerability. Exactly as Roger had suggested. Exactly as Daniel had feared. Then I found something even worse. A local planning document. Buried deep in public records. A proposed expansion map. And right in the center of the highlighted area sat my property. Not beside the project. Not near it. At the center. My house wasn't just valuable. It was essential. Without it, the entire development became significantly more difficult. I leaned back in my chair. Heart pounding. For weeks I had wondered why Frank wouldn't leave me alone. Now I knew. He didn't want my friendship. He didn't care about my grief. He didn't care whether I was lonely. He cared about leverage. And then I noticed one final detail in the records. A note attached to a recent project meeting. A note that mentioned my property specifically. The sentence was short. Only one line. But it made my blood run cold. Current owner may be more receptive following spouse's death. I read the sentence 3 times. Then a 4th. Then I printed the document because part of me couldn't believe what I was seeing on the screen. Current owner may be more receptive following spouse's death. The words felt clinical. Professional. Calculated. As if my husband's death were nothing more than a business variable. Not a tragedy. Not the worst experience of my life. A variable. A circumstance to be leveraged. My hands shook as I placed the printed page on the kitchen table. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. The anger I'd been carrying for weeks suddenly transformed into something colder. Something sharper. Clarity. For months, I had questioned my instincts. Wondered whether grief was making me suspicious. Wondered whether loneliness was making me overreact. Not anymore. Now I had evidence. Not assumptions. Not feelings. Evidence. The people circling my property had never been concerned about me. They had been evaluating me. The realization was devastating. Because it meant every act of kindness from Frank over the past 8 months now looked different. The casseroles he brought after Daniel's funeral. The offers to help with yard work. The frequent check-ins. The concern. The sympathy. Had any of it been genuine? Or had he simply been positioning himself closer to the target? That question haunted me all day. By evening, I couldn't keep the information to myself any longer. I called Megan. When she arrived, I spread everything across the dining room table. The notebook. The camera footage. The property maps. The investor records. And finally the printed document. She read the sentence silently. Then looked up at me. Her face had gone pale. What kind of people write something like this? I didn't have an answer. Because I was asking myself the same question. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then Megan said something that changed everything. Mom, you need a lawyer. The suggestion should have felt dramatic. Instead it felt obverse. Necessary. Long overdue. The next morning, I scheduled a consultation with a real estate attorney named David Keller. I expected him to dismiss my concerns, to tell me that everything was technically legal, that I was being emotional. Instead, after reviewing the documents, he became unusually serious, particularly when he saw the footage of Frank on my property, and even more serious when he read the project note. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Nolan, has anyone formally approached you with an offer?" "Only indirectly." He nodded. "Good. Good." I wasn't expecting that answer. "Why?" "Because if what you've shown me is accurate, they're being very careful." My stomach tightened. What does that mean? It means they know they're walking close to a line. The room suddenly felt colder. David pointed toward the documents. "Most of this isn't illegal." Then he tapped the camera footage. "But some of it might be." For the first time in weeks, I felt something unexpected. Hope. Not because the situation was improving. Because someone finally believed me. Someone objective. Someone who had nothing to gain. Before I left, David gave me one piece of advice. Document everything. Everything. Every conversation. Every visit. Every text. Every interaction. I promised I would. 3 days later, I got the opportunity. At 8:17 p.m., my phone rang. Frank. The sight of his name made my pulse spike. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Instead, I answered. "Hello." His voice sounded unusually friendly. "Teresa, I wanted to check on you." Of course he did. Always checking. Always watching. Always nearby. "I'm fine." A brief pause. Then he got to the real reason for the call. "I've been speaking with some people." There it was. The investors. The developers. The people behind the project. "I think we could put together a very attractive offer." We. Not they. We. One word. One accidental admission. I immediately understood its significance. Frank wasn't helping them. He was one of them. Trying to stay calm, I asked, "Why are you so interested in my property?" Silence. Not long. But long enough. Then he laughed softly. "You know how these things work." No. I didn't. And that answer told me everything. Because innocent people explain themselves. Manipulative people avoid the question. The call ended several minutes later. But one sentence remained stuck in my mind. Just before hanging up, Frank had said, "Eventually everyone has a price." As I stared at my phone, a terrible realization settled over me. Frank didn't think he was negotiating. He thought he was waiting. Waiting for me to become desperate enough. Lonely enough. Weak enough. To finally say yes. For the first time since Daniel died, I stopped feeling like a victim. The shift wasn't dramatic. It didn't happen all at once. It arrived quietly. Like a door finally unlocking inside my mind. For months, I had been reacting. Responding. Defending. Trying to understand what was happening around me. Now I understood. An understanding changes everything. Because once you recognize someone's strategy, their behavior loses much of its power. Frank wasn't mysterious anymore. He wasn't confusing. He wasn't a concerned neighbor. He was a man who wanted something. A man who thought patience would eventually wear me down. A man who believed grief had made me vulnerable. And that realization made me angry. Very angry. The following week, David helped me prepare a formal record of every interaction. Phone calls. Visits. Camera footage. Messages. Property documents. Everything. The file grew thicker every day. Looking at it was surreal. Months earlier, I would have laughed if someone told me I'd be collecting evidence against my neighbor. Now it felt necessary. One afternoon, David called. His tone was unusually serious. "Teresa, I found something." My stomach tightened immediately. "What is it?" "There are records showing Frank received compensation on several previous development acquisitions." I closed my eyes. Not because I was surprised. Because hearing it confirmed by an attorney made it real. Legally real. Officially real. How much compensation? David exhaled. Enough to explain his interest. The answer told me everything. This had never been about helping. It had never been about friendship. It had never been about concern. It was business. And I was the obstacle. 2 days later, things escalated. At first, the knock on my door sounded ordinary. 3 quick taps. Nothing unusual. Until I opened it. Victor was standing there again. This time he wasn't smiling. Not really. The professional friendliness had faded. In its place was something colder. More direct. "Mrs. Nolan." I remained in the doorway. "Can I help you?" I was hoping we could talk. "No." His jaw tightened slightly. Then he held up a folder. "We've prepared an offer." Offer. The word immediately irritated me. "No, thank you." He didn't leave. Instead, he opened the folder. "Perhaps you should at least see the number." I felt my patience evaporating. I said no. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Victor sighed. The sound carried unmistakable frustration. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be." The sentence hit me like a slap. Not because it was aggressive. Because it revealed exactly how they viewed me. An inconvenience. A problem. A delay. Not a homeowner. Not a widow. Not a person. Something standing in the way of a transaction. I stepped forward. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't afraid. I was furious. My husband died 8 months ago. Victor blinked. Clearly not expecting that. I continued. "You people keep talking about land." His expression changed. "You keep talking about money." Silence. "You keep talking about opportunity." His face hardened. "But this is my home." The words hung heavily between us. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Victor quietly closed the folder. Without another word, he turned and walked away. I watched him leave. Hands shaking. Heart pounding. Not from fear. From adrenaline. From rage. From finally saying what needed to be said. That evening, I thought the confrontation was over. I was wrong. At around 9 o'clock, Another vehicle pulled into my driveway. This time it wasn't Victor. It was Frank. I watched from the front window as he stepped out of his truck. He looked irritated. More irritated than I had ever seen him. My pulse quickened. A few seconds later, the doorbell rang. I opened the door only slightly. Frank. He didn't smile. No friendly greeting. No concerned neighbor routine. Nothing. For the first time, the mask was gone. I heard you refuse the offer. There it was. Direct. Honest. Finally. I stared at him. You seem very informed. The comment landed exactly as intended. His expression flickered. Just briefly. But enough. Enough to confirm everything. Then he said something that changed the entire situation. Something that revealed just how desperate he had become. You don't understand what's going to happen if you keep saying no. And at that moment, I realized this was no longer a negotiation. It was a threat. For a second, neither of us moved. The porch light cast a pale glow across Frank's face, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw exactly who he was. Not the friendly neighbor. Not the helpful widower from 2 streets over. Not the man who brought food after Daniel's funeral. Just a man who wasn't getting what he wanted. And he hated it. What exactly is that supposed to mean? I asked. Frank immediately looked away. A mistake. A small one. But noticeable. Because confident people repeat their threats. Manipulative people retreat when they're exposed. You're misunderstanding me. There it was. The familiar tactic. Backtracking. Reframing. Pretending the words meant something different. I almost laughed. For months he had treated me like someone fragile. Someone confused. Someone easy to influence. Not anymore. No, I said quietly. I think I understand perfectly. His jaw tightened. The silence between us stretched. Then he tried another approach. A softer one. Teresa, I'm trying to help you. The sentence made my stomach turn. Help. That word again. The same word he'd used for months. The same word that now sounded poisonous. I folded my arms. By pressuring me to sell my home? By helping you move forward. Move forward. As if keeping my home meant living in the past. As if grief had somehow disqualified me from making decisions. The arrogance of it made my blood boil. Frank sighed heavily. Then something unexpected happened. For the first time, his frustration broke through completely. You don't understand the opportunity you're throwing away. There it was. Not concern. Not sympathy. Opportunity. Money. Business. The truth. I stared at him. And suddenly I felt strangely calm. Because after months of uncertainty, there were no more masks. No more guessing. No more confusion. I finally knew who I was dealing with. You need to leave. Frank blinked. What? You need to leave my property. His face darkened immediately. The friendliness vanished. The patience vanished. Everything vanished. For a brief second, I saw pure anger. Then he turned around. Without another word. Without another excuse. without another smile, and walked back to his truck. The moment he drove away, I locked the door. Then I stood in the hallway shaking. Not from fear. From adrenaline. From exhaustion. From the realization that this nightmare had been building for nearly a year. The next morning, I called David. After hearing about the conversation, he became very quiet. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "Teresa, I think they're losing patience." The words sat heavily in my chest. Because I thought the same thing. The pressure had changed. Before, it was subtle. Friendly. Manipulative. Now it was becoming direct. Aggressive. Desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. 3 days later, one of those mistakes arrived. Megan called just after lunch. Her voice sounded shocked. "Mom, sit down." My stomach immediately tightened. What happened? I found something. The words made my pulse jump. What? You remember the investor records? Yes. I kept digging. I sat at the kitchen table. Heart pounding. Then Megan told me what she discovered. One of the investment groups connected to Victor and Frank had recently collapsed. Several deals had failed. Several investors had withdrawn. Funding problems. Financial pressure. Deadlines. Suddenly everything made sense. The urgency. The constant visits. The pressure campaign. They didn't simply want my property. They needed it. And that changed everything. Because people behave differently when they need something. More recklessly. More emotionally. More dangerously. That evening, David reviewed the information. His response was immediate. "This explains a lot." I nodded. "It does." But he wasn't finished. "There's something else." The seriousness in his voice instantly worried me. "What?" David paused. Long enough to make my heart race. Then he spoke. "Based on what I found, your property may be the final parcel they need." The room went silent. I stared at him. Certain I'd misheard. The final parcel? David nodded. If they don't acquire your property, the entire development becomes significantly more difficult. I couldn't speak. For weeks I had believed my home was important. Now I was learning it might be essential. The key piece. The missing piece. The piece everything depended on. And suddenly Frank's behavior looked even worse. Because this wasn't random pressure. It wasn't casual interest. It wasn't neighborly concern gone too far. They had built an entire plan around the assumption that eventually I would give up. That eventually I would break. That eventually I would sell. And they were discovering something they never expected. I wasn't going anywhere. But as I sat there processing the truth, another realization hit me. A frightening one. If my house was truly the final piece they needed, what would they do when they finally realized they couldn't have it? The answer came sooner than I expected. And when it arrived, it removed every remaining doubt. 2 mornings later, I stepped outside to collect my mail and immediately knew something was wrong. The street felt different. Too quiet. Too observant. A strange tension hung in the air. Then I saw it. A large sign planted near the edge of my property. Bright. Professional. Impossible to miss. Proposed development area. My stomach dropped. I walked closer. Several nearby properties were highlighted on a printed map. So was mine. No permission. No warning. No conversation. Just a public declaration sitting beside the road for everyone to see. I stood there staring at it. Anger rising with every second. People slowed their cars as they drove past. Neighbors looked. Some whispered. Others simply stared. And for the first time since this began, I felt publicly targeted. Not privately pressured. Publicly targeted. I took photographs immediately. Then called David. His reaction was immediate. Did anyone authorize that sign? No or good? The answer surprised me. Good? Because if they placed it without authorization, they just created another problem for themselves. Within an hour, David was contacting county officials. By lunchtime, Megan had arrived. She looked furious. What gives them the right? I didn't answer. Because there was no answer. Only arrogance. The sign remained for most of the day. Then something unexpected happened. County officials arrived. They inspected the area. Examined permits. Asked questions. Took photographs. Less than 2 hours later, the sign disappeared. Just like that. Gone. The speed of its removal told me everything. Someone knew it never should have been there. That evening, another surprise arrived. David called. And for the first time in months, he sounded optimistic. Very optimistic. Teresa, I think we've reached a turning point. My heart immediately sped up. What happened? The county is asking questions. That alone was satisfying. But he wasn't finished. Several agencies are now reviewing acquisition practices connected to the project. I sat down slowly, trying to absorb what he was saying. Because of the sign? Partly. Then he paused. But also because someone started talking. My pulse jumped. What do you mean? David lowered his voice. I can't share details yet. The next few seconds felt endless. Then he added, but it appears not everyone involved is happy. That night, I barely slept. For the first time in months, the pressure wasn't focused on me. It was focused on them. And that changed everything. 3 days later, I received another call. This time from Megan. She sounded breathless. Almost excited. Mom, turn on the news. What? Just do it. I grabbed the remote. Within seconds, I found the local station. And there it was. A story about the development project. Questions about investor practices. Questions about property acquisition methods. Questions about pressure tactics used against homeowners. No names were mentioned yet. But I recognized the project immediately. The same project. The same people. The same network. For several minutes I sat frozen in front of the television. Not because I felt victorious. Because I finally understood something. I had never been the only target. There were others. Other families. Other widows. Other homeowners. Other people who had experienced similar pressure. The realization broke my heart. and strengthened my resolve at the same time. That evening, I made a decision. A final decision. Not about selling. About fighting. I agreed to provide every document, every recording, every photograph, and every piece of evidence I had collected. No more silence. No more hoping the problem would disappear. No more protecting people who never protected me. When I hung up the phone after speaking with David, I walked onto the back porch. The evening air felt different. Lighter. For the first time since Daniel's death, I felt something I hadn't experienced in nearly a year. Control. Not over everything. Not over the past. Not over grief. But over my own choices. The house stood quietly behind me. The same house Daniel and I built our lives in. The same house others had tried to reduce to a number. A transaction. A profit margin. They had spent months trying to convince me I was powerless. Months trying to wear me down. Months waiting for me to surrender. Instead, they had given me something unexpected. A reason to stand up. And as I looked across the yard, I noticed Frank's house. Dark. Silent. No truck in the driveway. No movement. No watching eyes. Just darkness. For the first time, he wasn't watching me. Because suddenly, everyone else was watching him. 6 months later, I was sitting on the same back porch where Daniel and I had spent countless evenings together. The maple tree rustled softly in the summer breeze. Birds moved through the branches. The neighborhood looked peaceful. Normal. Almost exactly the way it had before everything happened. Almost. Because I wasn't the same person anymore. The investigation that began with a single sign and a collection of strange encounters had grown far beyond my property. Far beyond Frank. Far beyond anything I had imagined. As more homeowners came forward, a larger picture emerged. Stories that sounded painfully familiar. Persistent pressure. Misleading information. Manipulation disguised as concern. Attempts to exploit people during some of the most difficult moments of their lives. Widows. Retirees. Families dealing with illness. People facing financial hardship. People who thought they were alone. They weren't. None of us were. In the end, several development plans were delayed while agencies reviewed complaints and acquisition practices. Lawyers became involved. Regulators became involved. Reporters became involved. Questions that had been ignored for years were finally being asked. I didn't follow every detail anymore. At some point, I realized I didn't need to. The outcome that mattered most had already happened. I stopped being afraid. That was the real victory. Not headlines. Not investigations. Not legal disputes. Freedom. The freedom that comes from trusting your instincts again. The freedom that comes from refusing to be intimidated. The freedom that comes from realizing that being vulnerable does not make you weak. One afternoon, Megan joined me on the porch. We watched the sunset together. Much like Daniel and I used to. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled. You know, Dad would be proud of you. For a moment, emotion caught in my throat. Because I had thought about that many times. Especially during the hardest nights. The nights when I questioned myself. The nights when I wanted to give up. The nights when I wished Daniel were still here to tell me what to do. But looking back, I realized something important. He had already given me what I needed. Not instructions. Not answers. Confidence. The confidence to stand my ground. The confidence to protect what mattered. The confidence to recognize when something felt wrong, even when everyone else insisted it was fine. I thought about the note I had found in his notebook months earlier. Need to keep an eye on Frank. Such a simple sentence. At the time, it felt like a mystery. Now it felt like a final gift. One last warning from someone who knew me better than anyone. And one that may have saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life. Eventually Megan went home. The porch grew quiet again. I sat alone for a while, watching the evening light fade across the yard. The house behind me wasn't just wood and brick. It wasn't a financial asset. It wasn't an investment opportunity. It was 28 years of memories. Birthday parties. Christmas mornings. Late-night conversations. Laughter. Arguments. Loss. Love. A life. And no amount of money could ever reduce that to a transaction. Sometimes people ask whether I ever regretted fighting back. Whether it would have been easier to sell. Whether the stress was worth it. The answer is always the same. No. Because this was never really about the house. The house was simply where the story began. What I was truly protecting was something much bigger. My independence. My dignity. My right to make decisions about my own life. And perhaps the most surprising lesson of all was this. The people who try hardest to convince you that you're powerless are often the ones who depend on your surrender. Frank thought grief would make me easy to manipulate. He thought loneliness would make me desperate. He thought time would make me weak. Instead, the opposite happened. The more pressure he applied, the clearer I became. The more he pushed, the stronger I became. And the more he underestimated me, the more determined I became to fight. Today, when I look out across the yard, I don't see fear. I don't see pressure. I don't see threats. I see home. And for the first time since Daniel's death, that word no longer hurts. It feels like peace.